There's, if you've seen it already, there's 2 videos up there. One of them's kind of like you could do your text this way or you can do it this way. Either one, they have how to light it, how to render it out, how to do all that stuff. I want to show, obviously, what I want for this turn-in is basically you have your name exploding, or it was exploded, then it comes back together, right? So it goes, comes back together. You have some sort of platform. In the video, I show more of like this kind of thing, and then just like a little board. Lights in there, a camera moving across the thing, rendered out. That's all. That's the minimum of it. Okay. If you want to add other stuff to this, this is where this is going to be a bit more important. All right. So I'm going to go to about there. Okay. As you're testing anything out inside of Cinema, always be considered, or always look at the speed of how fast your stuff is working. So I showed this before. This is Alt-R, which is the interactive render region. Okay. And what this does is it shows you basically real time what's happening to your stuff. Now, the more stuff you add to it, the slower that's going to go and the less accurate it's going to be. So in the video, I show how you can add, obviously, depth of field. Just depth of field to this. And where'd you go? Right there. Let me just get rid of that real quick and then make this bigger again. I don't know what happened to that. Okay. So now this has depth of field on it, even though it doesn't have the stuff. If I added a camera in here, if I look through the camera, set up, this is a movie camera, and details, there it is, object, focus distance, that. Okay, so this has some blurriness to it, but you're not really getting the depth of field just because it doesn't calculate that. I actually have to go to a finer resolution rendering in order to see that. Even on this, I'm still not seeing it. I probably still have to lower this number to maybe 0.1 in order to see that. Oops. There we go. So now that I have this at 0.1, now you can see there's some fuzziness happening around here. 0.05, I'll even go further. Okay, so you can see that there is now some depth of field happening in my IPR. When I do my regular render, this is going to be, I hit the wrong button again, dang it. This is going to be a more accurate representation of what will actually render out, okay? So even though we have this IPR, it's nice. It can be useful in some instances, but it's not going to be accurate all the time, and it's not going to be fast all the time. So just be aware that we may want to at times use the IPR, at times we may not. If I'm doing anything, like let's say I set up the depth of field and then I want to do something different and I want to see what that looks like, I'm going to turn the depth of field off because I don't need to see what that looks like. I'm playing with something else. I need to focus on just that element, okay? Just like when we do lighting, sometimes we'll turn off all the lights and just focus on one light at a time versus I need to see every single light in the scene in order for that to work. Okay, so this will go pretty quick now that I've turned depth of field off. I don't have that stuff kind of obscuring what I'm doing. All right, so let's talk about lighting for a second. So so far we've shown a couple lights. So we've shown the standard light, which is just this point light. And you'll see that the second you put a light in the scene, that things start changing. Initially, everything was lit up very nice. I add a light, and now things are not all lit up kind of evenly, okay? When you create a default scene, there's nothing in it. It creates a default light for you so that you can see your stuff when it renders, okay? So everything is basically lit up, and it looks very fake because everything is lit up equally. So when we add an actual light to the scene, we're going to start seeing more stuff that is going to look more realistic to what we want to see. We're going to start to see more highlights. We're going to start to see more darker areas, and that's going to help with our shading and understanding what that's doing, okay? This initial light is just a point light. It's a light, basically like a light bulb. It's a dot in the middle, and it just emits light outward. I'm going to turn off this IPR for a second so you can see what that looks like. It's just that, okay? Now, all the lights have their own properties, special things that they may want to turn on, turn off, but there's a lot of common things that they also have. So I'm going to just move this. I'll move that there. That doesn't help out at all, does it? Scoot that down, scoot this over. All right, that kind of works. Probably scoot this over too. See that too much. Good. Okay. So the general area is going to be the same pretty much on every light. You're going to have a choice of what color you want, and I'm going to turn that IPR on again so we can see what it's doing. This is the color of your actual light that's coming out. Obviously, if I pick a blue wood or a brown wood and I pick a blue light, those two colors are going to mix. So I'm not going to get a brown wood with a blue light and it's still going to look like a brown wood. You have to play with those things. Typically, when you adjust lighting colors, unless you're going for something very drastic, like I show in the video, you typically want to take the saturation for that pretty far down. So I have a blue tinted light. I don't have a blue light. I don't have, that, okay? Something like this is nice because it gives it a tint. It doesn't like overpower it. We also have these intensity, and intensity is the strength of that light. It says 100%, and you'll see the bars up to the side. We can still push this beyond, so don't be afraid to even try that. You can just click and drag on these arrows, and now that light intensity is going to be even more, okay? Typically, you want to have some idea before you get into the lighting of what do I want this to look like. How many lights am I going to have? What camera angles am I going to be using? If I'm going to see an object from the back, from the front, from the sides, from the top, I need to make sure that all of those views are appropriately lit, okay? And in order for that to be appropriately lit, I need to make sure that there is some shading going on. If I put a light in the front, a light in the back, a light on top, a light on this side, and a light on that side, what's most likely going to happen is going to wash the entire thing out, okay? So typically I need to know where's my camera going to be so I can light it so that it looks best for that shot, okay? So in this specific scene, I'm basically staying in the front view the whole time. I'm sweeping my camera across the front of the letters. That's all I'm doing, okay? If I was going to shoot it from the back, then I have to be aware of what happens in the back. If I don't see the back, I don't care. So because of that, I may have multiple lights in the front, and because of that, I may need to adjust its intensity, because the more lights I add, the more intense the lighting is going to be. If this is at 100, and I start duplicating the light, so now I have 4 lights in there, it's 4 times as bright as it was a second ago, okay? So just be aware of those kinds of things. It says Omni Light. Point light is another word for it. You can change the lighting right here. I just typically leave it like that and just create a new light. Here's the kinds of shadows. So before we looked at these soft shadow maps, and if you look at this from above, we can see it better. Okay, so what these soft shadow maps are is basically where is this light not hitting. So in last week we talked about the definitions, and there is direct illumination, right? The light hits an object and lights things up. Because we're in 3D, there are certain areas that don't get lit up by lights because the light just doesn't penetrate that surface. That's what's causing the shadow. Now, soft shadow maps are basically taking the area that's not lit up and just blurring it, okay? Now, that's not accurate as to how lights work, because what happens in a typical light situation, you have a light, let's say it's this big, it has an actual shape and volume to it. So that as the light from this point is shining here, this one is shining there, and this one's shining here. So what happens is, as an object is closer, or as a shadow is closer to the object, it's tighter, and then as it's further away from the object, it's a bit softer. If you're outside on a sunny day and you look down at your shadow, the shadow by your feet is a little bit crisper. Further out, it's a bit softer, right? That's something you probably have seen before. So this is not accurate, but it's quick, okay? If I, just so we can see this, if I hit Control R, Shift R. If I hit Shift R, you'll be able to see how fast this one goes. And this is kind of a good indicator too as to what's working and what's not. You want to be able to compare stuff. So typically when I render, I'll use Shift R so that I can see here's the before and here's the after. Okay? So here's my before. This is 10 seconds long. I'm going to change this to hard shadow, ray trace hard, and I'll hit Shift R again. Okay, now this one is going to take 5 seconds. Obviously, from looking at the two, this one looks a lot worse than the other one. Here's the other one, there's this one. But you can definitely see exactly what I was talking about. This is the hard, this is what it blurred out, okay? That's what those two are doing. Now the best one to use is this one down here, which is the area one. The area one actually takes our light, which is just a pinpoint, and it gives it an actual shape. And then that shape emits light, and then where it's really bright, it's bright, and where it's not so bright, it's dark, and then where it's in between, you get these like grayed out values, okay? So we should get more of that phenomenon I was talking about, where we do see close to the object, it's going to be harder shadows. Further away, they should be a bit softer. Okay, you can definitely see that, especially right here, especially right there. Look how hard it is right by the object, and as it goes further away, it's softening that effect. So here's this one, horrible. Let's just delete it so we never have to look at that again. Move the image, yes. Okay, here's this one, there's that one. Again, there's no real comparison as to which one looks better. That one definitely looks better for that final image. It looks more realistic, something we're more used to. This one just looks like a big garbled mess of something on there. Okay. Look at the render time. This one took 10 seconds. This one took 11. As we get further in the class, we have to pay attention to how long things are taking. If it takes a minute a frame and we have 120 frames, how long is that going to take to render?
2 hours.
2 hours. Perfect. You even converted it. All right. So that's one way that we can play with the shadows. Okay. And then when we do tell it that their area or whatever, we turn one of these on, we can then go to the shadow tab and then tweak this further. If I don't like how dark the shadows are, I can tweak the shadows and make them a little bit lighter. Sometimes I'll do that just so there's a little bit more transparency in it. Okay. When we talk about kind of faking the bouncing of light, that's typically what I'm doing, is softening the shadows. Right now this is super dark because my light hits this object and there's nothing behind it. If I had a bounced light, it would hit the object, it would bounce up, and then it would bounce back on the shadows, and there would be some softening that happens there. So I'm going to take this density, and I'll put it down to, let's say, 50. And then we'll hit Shift-R again. And what we're going to see is my shadow is still there, but now it's a lot softer. And what it does is it gives us the appearance that, hey, there actually is some bounced light global illumination inside the scene, because of how soft that is, okay? And again, this is going to be per object, per scene, per item, per whatever situation is what you're going to have these things set to. Now look at this one. Even though it was the same camera shot and everything, this one took 23 seconds to render versus 11 seconds. So now we've doubled our time, right? So if it was a minute before and now it's 2 minutes a frame, now we're taking 4 hours instead of 2 hours to render our stuff out. All right, so you have to be, again, aware of that. I'll just leave this at 75 for now. You can also play with the color. Depending on what you're trying to emulate, the light or the shadow color will change too. So at night, shadows are actually like a dark purpley bluish color, okay? Or in the winter also. In the morning, they may be a yellowy, orangey kind of tinted. Not colored, but just tinted. Okay, and again, Shift-R. Okay, it looks horrible on here because it's gray, but you get the idea. All right. Set this back to black. All right. Cool. So, back to this one. Visible light. If I go here, and I say I want this light to be visible, and this is where I can use my Alt-R so I can see this, I'll actually be able to see where that light's coming from. Let me turn this back to none. There it is on visible. Now on this kind of light, there's not a huge impact on it, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch this, instead of an Omni light, I'm going to make this a spotlight. And a spotlight is more of like what you would expect a spotlight to be, like in a theater or a flashlight type thing. So I can actually see, like, there's that cone that's shining out of it. So if we're walking in a forest and it's kind of foggy, I want my character to be able to see that fog coming off of the light, that's where this would come in. Now watch how awesome this is if I move this to the right spot like this, and I pull that back like that. That's cool. Alright. So there's my light fog. Now notice how it stops about here. If I look at where my light itself stops about there. So if I pull this back, I'll get more of that fog going behind it. Okay? Now what we're seeing here is straight up, here's my light, here's this cone, and all that stuff. If I go here and change this from visible to volumetric, what it's going to do is it's actually going to interact with the surfaces more. Okay, now it's taking longer because I have a lot of stuff going on there. Let me move it to a more simple area, like that. There we go. Okay, so now what we're getting is the light's hitting the surfaces, and it's creating these like dark shadowy streaks in it, because that's what a light actually should be doing, right? As I get closer, I'm going to be able to narrow that down some more and move it around. I can create some pretty cool effects with this. Now, as I get into these areas where I'm here, there's a lot more stuff happening. That's why that's taking longer. So again, something we need to be aware of. That looks really cool how that's doing that. And again, I'll hit Shift R just to see. You'll get a better, more accurate representation here. Yeah, that looks pretty cool like that. Sweet. Yes. So that's taking this and making it a volumetric versus a visible. If I do inverse, this is kind of a weird one, but wherever it's dark, it'll be light, and wherever it's light, it'll be dark. There you go. Now you may ask yourself, why would you want something like this? If I'm inside of this room and I'm trying to give it the look that these light rays are coming into this room, I can use that. That way it's not actually lighting up the outside, it's just giving us the light rays on the inside of the room, okay? So that's just an easy way to be able to do that. I'm going to set this back to none for now, just so it goes a little quicker. Visible light, yes. You can turn things on and off, so based on this specific item here, and this is going to get more into the advanced stuff once we start playing with some products and whatever else. If I drop a material on here, I go into my color, I'll just make it white, I guess. And then I'll take my reflection, and set that to ward. Just crank these up. There we go. Okay. All right. Let me take the light intensity up a smidge. Come on. I think it broke. Light. Oops, my value went down. What happened there? Okay. One of the bad things about IPR is that sometimes it does just like glitch out and you have to just restart it. Okay. So our light, we can tell it to not emit certain aspects of the light. Okay. So right now, imagine that we had this car and we're like, cool, the car looks great. We have this nice red color on it, but I don't like how dark this specific area is. If I add another light into that scene, what's going to happen is it's going to add a new reflection on there as well as making that car brighter, okay? So you can turn things off, like I don't want the light to emit a diffuse, okay? And the diffuse is just the color. So right now it's only giving us the specular. It's only giving us the reflection part of it. I can turn that off and turn on the specular part. So now it's not emitting any specularity, it's just emitting reflection. Okay, or only color. So you can turn those things on and off. Now that's again something that down the line you may play with, but I just want you to see where it's at. Obviously there are some details here that you can play with of what the specific stuff is. So let me jump back to general. That's not the one I want. Display. Just want to turn on the visibility of it. Yes. Let me create a light again. It's not giving me the option to turn the light on. So I'm going to make an area light this time. Oops, sorry, a spotlight. Shadow, spot, yes. So set this to area, spotlight, details, enter. Oh, duh. Yeah. Yep, I did create the wrong one, that's why. So I do need an area light. There he is. Okay. So now I have an area light, and again, it's not lighting up everything the same way the other ones did. But what this does allow me to do is turn on show and render. Okay, and the area light is now a visible item. So if I was trying to create something like these beams or these fluorescent light bulbs up here, I could basically put an area light up there and say show and render, and it actually look like there's lights up there. So that can be definitely handy when you have something in your scene that you want to show off. Again, there's more settings here of what the shape is, so I can make this rounded. Now this could also be something that is visible in our item. So if we had reflections on, let's take our material here. Oh, why is it assigning it to that? There we go. I'm going to take our material there. I'm going to take the color brightness down and take my reflection roughness down. There we go. Okay. So now what we're able to see is this is the light reflecting into that item. Okay. So again, if I had a vehicle or I had a product and I'm trying to render that out and I want to see those reflective items in there just to help make those reflections pop more, that's where I could turn that on and then customize what this shape looks like. Okay. So again, you can choose different ones. There's sphere, there's whatever. It's giving me all these dots because the ground is also reflective. I'm just going to assign a basic material to the ground. There we go. So now that looks like reflective metal type stuff. Sweet. You can play with the size of it. There's samples. So if you see that there is a lot of grain, which is basically noise, dots, something, whatever. If we look at, let me delete this because we don't need to see that anymore. I'm just going to pop that off, so I can just move that right there. Okay. Let's go back to Spotlight. Let's move this into position. There we go. All right. So in here, we're seeing some noise. You can kind of see it right here. It's kind of like checkerboarded, right? So that's the noise. That's the grain that's coming from the light. Now this is IPR, so when I do my actual render, it may not be there, but just so you can see where we would adjust that. Under any of these things where we add shadows, nope, that one doesn't have it. If I went to the regular soft shadows, it has a resolution here, so we could up the resolution in that case, and that will give us crisper shadows, not so blurry shadows. If we go to the general visibility details, where am I at? Visibility, fall off, sample distance. Probably on the other light still. That one. Yeah, so if I added this area light here, I could take those samples up, and that will give me more clearer rendering on that specific light. So apparently area light's the only one that has that. I thought they all did. Okay. Now, again, in this case, it's not so important that you know exactly where these things are right off the bat. It's just a matter of knowing that you have a light, I see grain, I need to fix something somewhere, okay? Usually it's going to be something called samples or resolution, somewhere in the light that you would then go ahead and adjust it, okay? Again, you could also say show and reflection, show and render. Now I can see, if I angle this correctly, yep, there's that item in my reflection and in my render. And then you could also turn this down, which is kind of neat. You can do that. Okay. So now this is an item that you will be playing with. If I can grab the correct light again, there it is. Is the drop off under details. Okay, the fall off. So every light in the real world, it starts at a certain point, and then it just gradually fades off into wherever it goes. Okay. In 3D, it does not do that. So if you look at this light the way it is right now, it's pretty much, not perfectly, pretty much as strong as it is at the beginning, is it at the end. It is at the end. I can't talk. So if we change this to physically accurate, what we're going to see is now we have more of a softening on those edges. Okay? So our light is actually fading, and that's what lights should be doing. You can control all of these settings by just playing with these numbers that are under, obviously, that specific area. Okay? So the more you want your light to affect, the further you want it to go, that's where you're going to be adjusting those kinds of things. You can also use gradients for coloring. This is kind of a neat thing. Again, something maybe specialized that you wanted to do. But I'm going to go crazy colors just so you can see what's happening. So the first part of this is blue. And then the second part of this can be, you know, just another color. So I can make it red. And you'll see how I can take this cone angle and go from blue to red. Again, not something you do it all the time, but you may want to go from like a light blue to a dark blue, or one color to a different one. What else do we have? That's fine there. On a spotlight, you have several different controls. So we have the cone angle itself. So we make that bigger or make that smaller. Right. We also have the drop off there. That's on several lights. And where's that one thing? Lens. All right. This is a neat thing. So you can actually change what your light looks like. So in the area light, we could see it was basically just a square, which is kind of neat. If we're looking at this like so, we should see the light source, right? The light's right in front of us. Typically, you would see it. If we had a camera, we would see that light source. This is where you can do that under lens. So if I go here and I choose, let's say, flashlight, we'll be able to see that. Now, as I move my camera around, you have to hit the right angle. If you don't get the right angle, it's not going to show anything. So I'm going to try it about there. So now I can see a lens flare coming off of that flashlight, showing me what that thing looks like. And again, you can adjust the brightness, you can adjust the aspect ratio, you can edit even more specific settings right there. A whole bunch of stuff you can do. It's pretty sweet. I would recommend, if you do decide that you want to use something like this, that you at least change the settings, because if you just go with something that's default and you use that in your demo reel, people are going to realize that's the default. You really don't know what you're doing with it. Okay, so I would go into this and maybe change some settings just to kind of make it your own.
Just kind of make it look like you know what you're doing.
Right. That's all we need to do. We have to just make people think we know what we're doing. We don't need to actually know what we're doing. Okay. Now, if I'm back here, that light isn't shining in the camera, I won't see anything. Okay. So just be aware of that too. Also, if I am going to show the light source like that, I may want to actually model a canister or something of where that light's coming from. It all depends, again, on what your end result is going to be. If I'm going to take this and wrap a camera that comes in, kind of flies in from outer space, and then goes along my letters, I'd want to show some sort of setup there of where that arm is that's shining the light, so that when I do get around to there and I show it, I can still see some sort of highlight or something around that can or something. Okay. You can also add noise to your lights, so this can be a nice little touch. We talked before about using IES lights. That's where we download that profile from the internet where we can make it look like a specific light bulb. But we can also just add noise to things, and it usually does a pretty good job. If I do both on here, you'll see how it just gives that light a little bit more something apart from flat coloring. Again, looking at it like this, it's kind of like, well, that looks stupid. But just adding it into your scene as something that's kind of like overall could look nice. Not crazy bright like this. Maybe softer, so I can take the contrast down to like 50 maybe. Or take the illumination scale.
Can you use those IES profiles?
There we go.
Maya?
Yeah, you can use those in Maya too. Taking the illumination scale down to 1, you see how it softened that up a little bit. I could have also played with the visibility scales here. I could have also played with the octaves. I could have changed the kind of turbulence that it is or kind of noise that it is. So there's lots of different ways I could do that. Everything, again, can be animated, so I can grab this and move it around and animate it and whatever else. In the video, I show rotating them side to side, moving that because you want to have some sort of motion on these lights because they're more like spotlights or searchlight type things. I'm going to drop a new material on here. I think I added it to the ground again. There we go. Yep. All right. So on this, I'm going to grab a texture. Remember when you do your textures that every time you start to do your textures, you start to do your new scene, that you go to your preferences, you go to that files area, and you load in where that specific file is going to be grabbed from. Okay, so in this case, I'm grabbing it from my title sequence folder. So when I click this, it put me in my wrong folder because it went to where the other one was. And then I go into here and I grab my texture. Sure. Cool. All right, so this is what I was talking about where the IPR is not very accurate. Okay, so looking at it like this texture looks pretty horrible. You really can't see the detail that's in there. I'm going to turn that off. If I do a Control R on this, you can definitely see a little bit more of how that's getting picked up. I'm going to make my light a bit brighter so you can see it because I'm pretty sure it's dark up there. Alright, so now you can definitely see a little bit more of that texture. If I added a bump to this, okay, that's another way that we talked about we can add details to things. You can actually copy and paste. So I can go to this color here, and I can go to this arrow, and I can say I want to copy this channel, copy that picture, and put it on bump, and paste right there, paste channel. Okay, so I could do that, or I could just click here and just reload in that same image. I don't know why it's asking me that because it is set up. No, should be set up. Cool. So now we'll click Control R, look at it. Not a whole lot is going on. Whenever you use bump, it's using contrast. Okay, so if you look at this picture, that picture doesn't have a whole lot of contrast. It's pretty much one solid value across the whole thing with some minor items there. So what you can do, and this is why I didn't copy and paste it, is that I can adjust the black points and the white points to give it more contrast. Okay, I can also just bring the image into Photoshop and use levels just to make it have more contrast. If I pull this up like this, oops, that's too far. That's too far. Pull this down. Come on. I can also go to my bump here and take the strength like crazy high up. There we go. Okay. Now this looks horribly ugly. Once I hit Control R though, I'm going to get a better representation of what it's going to look like in the end. And that looks a lot better than it did a second ago. Okay. So don't always trust what you're seeing in IPR because the IPR will look like junk. That looks pretty horrible. Don't always trust what you're seeing just in the viewport. Control R or Shift R going into those other viewers will actually show you what it's going to look like when it renders. So that looks pretty good there as to how this is laying out. Okay. And if I go to this image again, just so you can see what it looked like before I added this, there's still not a whole lot of bump until I added more of this contrast here by taking this up to, I don't know what it was, 0.4 and 0.6. There we go. Okay. Now the other thing I'm going to look at is if I zoom in here on the sides, you'll see that we have this nice texture right here in the front, this kind of ugly, weird thing happening here, and then we have a bunch of streaks happening on the side. Okay. Whenever we add a flat image to a 3D model, it takes that 3D model and it flattens it out, and then it just sticks your image on there, okay? But it doesn't always do it the correct way. So if I come over here and I click on that material, these are the options for how it's unfolding that item and slapping that picture on there. So right now it's using what's called a UVW map, okay? If I switch to this UV edit, and I click on this item, and I go to that. I may have to disable my poly effects. All right. I'm going to duplicate this and then grab it. That. Nothing is there. Where are you? Fit to screen. No. Alright, well. They're not laid out anyway, so I guess it really doesn't matter. Okay? There's nothing there, just kind of like making a guess. So anyway, what we have to do is tell it a better way to lay them out, or a better way to lay that texture, so that it makes sense. Now we did this in the first one, the mini room. We had a picture we put on the wall, and we wanted to make sure that it fit in that area, okay? So these are the different ways. You can see that. These are the different ways that it does that. So UVW mapping means read the map that you have. Just so you can see what it looks like for an object, I'm going to grab this cube and go into the UV map so you can see what this looks like. Display. Why aren't you showing it? There it is. See this box right here? That's the UVs for that. So if I were to drop a texture on there, oh, I didn't want that. I can probably do it here. There we go. So if I drop that picture on there, what happens is it's basically just like projecting it here, projecting it here, projecting it there on each side of this, okay? If I took that material and instead of having that, I'm going to grab that picture of that monkey just so we can see the direction it's going. There you go. And it went on my ground too. I'll just fix that later. You can see how he's being placed on each side of this evenly, okay? If that monkey picture is on the other one, you can see what it's doing here. It's projecting it in the front, streaking it on the side, okay? So I'm just going to delete these off of there. Okay. So if I take this cube again, there he is, and I go to projection and I go to these, you'll see these are different ways that it can project these, okay? So if I hit sphere, what it's doing is, we can't see it, but there's basically this sphere that's wrapping around it, and that's how it's going to try to wrap that picture of a monkey on top of this cube. And so this is how it unfolded it. Now if you've ever taken a cereal box and you've cut it down the edge and you've flattened it out, right? Kitchen hack, that's a great pizza box. Like if you need to make your own pizza at home, you need a thing. Yeah. So that's a sphere. This one is cylinder. This one is frontal. Okay, frontal is like whichever direction I'm facing. See how it just like projects it right from there. This is flat, pretty much what we had a second ago. This is cubic. Cubic is actually what we had a second ago. This flat one is basically looking at it from the front view and just projecting it like that. So what would happen is if we took that material, I'm just going to make a new one. 4. Come on. And I'm going to delete this light too. Or actually, I can just go to one of these options here. I don't turn the lights off that often. Where are the lights at? I'll just delete it. That'll make it easier. Or just hit this button. That's how you turn it on. There we go. So this flat one, what it's doing is it's projecting it from the front. So the front of this is going to look good, but you'll see the sides don't. Because basically what's happening is taking those edge pixels and streaking them back. Here is that frontal one. Like I said, wherever I'm kind of angled, that's where it's projecting that image. Okay? If I go to cubic, it's back to the first one. If I go to cubic 2, this gives it more of what we should have. Okay? So that pizza box or that cereal box that we unfold, that's what it typically looks like when you unfold it. Okay? And so now that picture of the monkey is actually laid out pretty decently. Obviously not perfect, but pretty decently. There's also box. You'll see that they do the same thing in this case. Sometimes they'll do different. And there's also shrink, which is some other way of figuring it out. And then there's manual ways to do it. Typically for advanced stuff, I take it out of Cinema, but for this basic stuff, we don't need to worry about it. Okay? So all of these are different ways to have it permanently unwrap the UVs. Back to standard. Delete my cube. Oops. There we go. For the text that we have here, I've apparently deleted the wrong stuff. Delete this, delete this, delete that. Drop that on there. There we go. For this type of thing, I'm going to tell it to do one of these. Now you'll see that these options are the same thing. Now these are only for Cinema. And what that means is if I take this piece of geometry into another application, it automatically is going to default to this, to that UV map. So if I'm taking it out, I have to do something different. If I'm staying in the software, I can pretty much play with these. So I believe for this one, cubic is the one that's going to work best. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to look best. And you'll see that it definitely looks better than it did. You'll see how the texture now wraps all the way around this object versus where it was here. Oops. And it was streaking it here and here and then making it visible there. Okay? So in this case, I'm using cubic. For this type of object, for this type of scene, this works pretty good. Okay? And even inside my letters, I'll get some pretty nice looking stuff inside there too. Sweet. Okay. Cool. Turn my light back on too. Alright, so that's going to be the stuff I wanted to show. Again, the base assignment of this is that you have the text coming together. It starts off with invisible, so you can't see it at all, just like this one does. You can't see it at the very beginning. And then it just kind of floats into existence. There we go. You'll have your camera that sweeps across it. So it'll be like down here. And you just show it moving along as it's coming into existence. Okay. And then at the end of this, the camera should be back on here. In the video, I show how to do 2 cameras. Definitely a good way to do that is to do 2 cameras. One sweeps across, another one pulls back. That way you have the ability to not try to fit everything into one camera, because that can get very intense, very quick movements. You got some cool lights in there moving around. I changed the color of them. You could obviously give them some tints if you wanted to. And then just making a movie of that. Okay? Ideally, you should have this kind of wrapped up by the end of next class, at least ready to render. Next week we're going to start on our next assignment, which is going to be the product stuff. Okie dokie. Questions? All right.